Hello again, everybody, and welcome back to Truth Be Known. Well, as you know, we went through last time, we looked at the book of Genesis. We discovered the who, what, where, when, why, and how about the book of Genesis. But tonight we're going to be looking at the creation story. So we're going to pick up where we left off in verse 3 of our story, and we're going to read down to verse 19. So here we go. Let's start in verse 3 of Genesis chapter 1. It says, "And God said, Let there be light, and there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good, and God divided the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And the evening and the morning were the first day. And God said, Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. And God made the firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament, and it was so. And God called the firmament heaven," in verse 8, "and the evening and the morning were the second day," verse 9. "And God said, Let the waters under the heavens be gathered together unto one place, and let the dry land appear, and it was so." Verse 10, "God called the dry land earth, and gathering together of the waters called the seas, and God saw that it was good." Verse 11, "God said, Let the earth bring forth grass, the herb yielding seed, the fruit tree yielding fruit after its kind, whose seed is in itself upon the earth, and it was so." 12, "And the earth brought forth grass and herb yielding seed after its kind, and the tree yielding fruit, whose seed was in itself after its kind, and God saw that it was good." Verse 13, "And the evening and the morning were the third day. And God said," verse 14, "Let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs, for seasons and days and years. And let them be for lights in the firmament of the heaven to give light upon the earth. And it was so. And God made two great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night. He made the stars also, and God set them in the firmament of the heaven to give light upon the earth, and to rule over the day and over the night, and to divide the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good." 19, "And the evening and the morning were the fourth day." Well, just a cursory reading of that whole section from verse 3 all the way to verse 19, just a cursory reading of it could send anyone's head spinning. So we're going to try to unpack this, and we're going to go through it and take a closer look at it, and see what God is trying to convey in these verses. So let's go back and look again at verse 3, and it says, "And God said, Let there be light, and there was light." Now, this particular verse is very interesting to us because we know that this is only the first day of creation, and God didn't create the sun and the moon and the stars until the fourth day of creation. So what in the world is he talking about right now in verse 3? Well, here we go. The word light in verse 3 can literally be taken as an illumination, but not just any kind of illumination. It's a bright illumination, like a clear light that probably only God could produce. The only way you can describe it is like a pure white light, like a lightning strike, a bolt of lightning God is flexing his muscle and strength and might here in this verse, and he's showing you, hey, I've got the spark of life and I can speak it into existence and do exactly what I intend it to do. And that's what's being spoken of here in verse 3, is God's illumination upon the earth. He's bringing forth the spark of life that's been given to the earth now at this point. And in verse 4, let's go back into and look at verse 4. It says, and God saw the light that it was good, and he divided the light from the darkness. Okay, so you have two forces here that are at work. You have light that God has put, and there's also darkness that's also there. And whenever you come across light and darkness in the Bible, it's usually speaking, one of them is speaking of good and the other one is speaking of evil, right? Darkness is usually representative of evil, and light is usually something that's coming from God. As we know, the Bible teaches that God is light and there is no darkness in him at all. And so with that said, God called the light day in verse 5, and the darkness he called night. And the evening and the morning were the first day. So God's done, he's flexed his muscles, he's shown what power and might he can display, okay? And he's separated it. So you could speculate that right here when it says that he, looking back at verse 4, you could speculate that God is separating good from evil. Now, is this saying something about the fall of Satan? We don't know, but what we do know is Bible is replete when it's speaking on light and dark. The Bible also teaches something that's very, very interesting. In Psalm 19, verse 1, it says, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament his handiwork. Psalm 97:6 teaches, the heavens declare his righteousness, and all the people see his glory. So whenever you're watching a thunderstorm and you see that lightning strike, you're seeing a display right there that God has put place. And every time I see lightning, I am like awestruck. I'm like, wow, isn't that our normal reaction? That's a wow reaction whenever we see God's force at work displayed for us in the heavens, okay? God mentions that in John 8:12, he says, Jesus speaking here, he says, I am the light of the world. So we see that light is being portrayed in many different aspects throughout the Bible, but for verse 3, we can suffice it to say that this is a tremendous reflection or declaration by God about his glory and might and power and strength. Okay, so let's move on. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night, and the evening and the morning were the first day. And God said, verse 6, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. Now, what is it talking about there? When God talks about a firmament, he's talking about the expanse between heaven and earth, okay? And in talking about the waters, dividing it from the waters, well, water exists in three states, right? It can be either a solid, it can be a liquid, or it can be a vapor. And that's what it's talking about here, is it says, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. That's all that's simply stating, is that God has water. At that particular point in time, God had a water vapor that was surrounding the earth in the form of a water type canopy, okay? And during the flood, or when God caused the flood, that canopy of water that is being spoken of here in verse 6 and 7 and 8, that canopy is broken, and we'll talk about that a little bit later about the flood scenario. So verse 7, it says, "And God made the firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament," okay, "from the waters which were above the firmament, and it was so." So all he's doing is he's making a separation. There's like a separation that's happening. He divided it, so it's distinct and separate. Verse 8, "And God called the firmament heaven, and the evening and the morning were the second day." So he's got his, in the process of making the earth habitable for man, he's got these processes that are happening. So he's displaying his might in verse 3, and he's displaying separating factors. He's got atmospheric things that are going on and taking place, and he's setting the stage for the rest of his creation. So let's keep reading on. Verse 9, it says, "And God said, Let the waters under the heaven be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear, and it was so." So you have water that's like coagulating together and coming together to form the bodies of water, okay, in the oceans, and then you have probably the mountains that are rising up out of it. Now, it was probably a pretty turbulent time, and as those mountains were being formed from the center of the earth, or however God did it, those mountains are being formed. And it was so, the Bible says. So, "And God called the dry land earth, and gathering together of the waters he called the seas." Verse 10. "And God saw that it was good." Verse 11, "And God said, Let the earth bring forth grass, the herb yielding seed, and the fruit tree yielding fruit after its kind, whose seed is in itself upon the earth, and it was so." So it would seem that God is using age dating factors in his creation, because it states, if you look at again in verse 11, it says, "Let the earth bring forth grass, the herb yielding seed, and the tree, the fruit tree, yielding fruit," which would allude to God's having age dating factors at work in his creation, and we'll see that further with the creation of man. Verse 12, "The earth brought forth grass, and herb yielding seed after its kind, and the tree yielding fruit, whose seed was in itself after his kind, and God saw that it was good." Verse 13, "And the evening and the morning were the third day." Now, the fact that you have evening and morning that's mentioned here, it would allude to me, or it would cause me to think that the earth is already orbiting around this great light that God was using. And you say, "James, how can God make herb and seed and all these things develop just from this great light? If it's not the sun, then what is it?" Well, here's your answer. In Revelation chapter 1, verse 23, it says, it talks about God himself as being the light in the center when he creates the new Jerusalem and the new heavens and the new earth, that light source will be the source that sustains everything. So the plausibility of this light that God created in verse 3 could actually be enough of a sustaining element to sustain the grasses and the herbs and the trees, just by God's might and his will and his power alone, these things are possible. He showed it before the creation, and it's also going to be displayed when God is finished with the creation, according to Revelation 21:23. So, verse 14, it says, "And God said, let there be lights in the firmament of heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years." Are you starting to notice something here with me? You're starting to notice the elements of design in his creation. This is one thing that God wants us to notice, because he knew that there would be the skeptics out there that would say that it happened by chance. But when you look up into the signs and you look up into the sky, and they're given, it explains it. It says they're given for signs and seasons and for days and years. In other words, you might see in January, you'll see Orion's belt down here. You know it's January, but when you see Orion's belt over here, you might think, oh, well, it must be November if you're an astronomer. Okay, Orion's belt is here, okay, it must be November, but when Orion's belt is down here, okay, it's probably closer to January, because that's what they're there for. They're there to direct time and everything that goes with it. Okay, that's where we get our seasons. 15, back to Genesis chapter 1, verse 15. It says, "And let them be for lights in the firmament of heaven to give light upon the earth, and it was so." So now we see another aspect of the lights that are given in the heavens, okay, that they're to bring light upon the earth. So now we see the lights in the firmament of the heaven give light upon the earth, and it was so. That same light that's being used is the same light that was used in verse 3. So God is still using his might and his power at this point, and it's going upon the earth. Now in verse 16, that all changes. It says, "And God made two great lights." Okay, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night. He made the stars also. So those two lights are referring to the sun as the greater light, and the moon as being referred to as the lesser light. Now, the word "made" in verse 16 is very interesting word, because, as I said before, God created, that word is bara, but the word "made" used in verse 16, it has a variance of meaning. It could be to make something from something. That's also true, but in verse 16, we see that the word "made" can actually be translated to work, or to labor, or toil, or accomplish. So I can just see it. God has all this stuff in place. He's got the planets in place. He's got the sun, the moon, the stars in place. And he spoke and gave them their marching orders, if you will. He made, it says, verse 16 again, it says, "And God made the lights to rule the day, and the lights to rule the night." So he gave them specific tasks, okay? That's what they're there to do. And it's being further displayed in verse 16. So these lights that he's putting there, they all have purpose, they all have meaning. They're either to show us his glory, or they're there to sustain us. back to Genesis chapter 1. It says in verse 17, "And God set them in the firmament of the heaven to give light upon the earth." Now, I thought it interesting. I've been doing word studies all afternoon, and that word, I wanted to just point out that the word set, in verse 17, it means to give or apply or appoint. So in verse 17, where it says, "And God set them in the firmament," he gave them to the firmament of the heaven to give light upon, or appointed them. Isn't that interesting? How God can appoint things in the heavens that are there and are necessary to sustain mankind. Verse 18, "And to rule over the day and over the night, and to divide the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good." Verse 18. Verse 19, "And the evening and the morning were the fourth day." Now, I think that's what I have covered so far. Has been a lot to take in, and we're running. I can keep going on this all night because it doesn't bother me a wink, but I know that for the sake of time, we're going to go ahead and end it right there. So I hope you were blessed by this as much as I was. There's a lot of insight here, and we are going to pick up speed as we go along, but the first book of Genesis is the hardest to wrap our heads around. We're not God. We're not infinite. We don't think like him, and God is trying to put his creation story in word form, and it's a challenge to us unless somebody can explain it to you and give validity to the text. So with that said, I hope you were blessed by it, and we'll see you next time on Truth Be Known. Read ahead. Bye.